Podcast with me, Carly. Hope you are all well, witches. Sorry for my absence. As you know, as I've gone on about, I was ill for a good portion of February, so I struggled to catch up with myself with some work for the Witches Institute, my Patreon. I also started, optimistically, another intense episode to research before going down south to see family and friends. And I just couldn't finish it in time where I would be happy with it going out. So I decided to give myself that time to start afresh this week. This has enabled me to catch up with myself. So thank you for being patient. It's really helped me out starting again this week. The Dragon and Medusa episodes got deep with research, as has this one, so today's episode, which I've loved researching, and I hope you find it of interest. It's funny how dragons then moved into Medusa, still with that serpentine energy. We haven't strayed too far away, as today we are looking at the toad and its connections to witchcraft. Links that blew my mind and I was just not expecting. So we're not looking at the toad per se, but toad witches. I do need to give you a bit of a trigger warning, as there are mention of some horrible ways that some treated the toads at points during the episode. I just need to say, obviously don't try this at home, witches. I love toads, so this did break my heart a little, but the references are fairly minimal. I've just released an episode over on my Patreon called Magic Mushrooms, which again I loved researching, which is all about the shamanic use of mushrooms throughout various cultures. So there's a ton on the fly agaric, how you can work with mushrooms and their energy in your craft. And my favourite part, their connections with the Fae and the otherworld. I've also just released a Meeting Medusa meditation, which is focused on releasing people-pleasing habits, looking in the mirror at where you are now and who you could be if you release some of these tendencies and work on boundaries and so on. Something I'm always working on. The saga continues. Not to bombard you, I am terrible with self-promotion, but I'm currently beavering away, writing another zine, which I'm aiming to bring out during May, which is a macabre little read all about death and witchcraft, baneful magic, death customs, death priestesses, the underworld, and happy little topics like that. But in the meantime, if you would like something perhaps a little jollier for Ostara and spring, I released a zine last year called The Hedge Witch's Broomstick, which covers Ostara, how you might wish to honour it. There's egg witchcraft, hot cross buns and their magical associations, and a recipe, of course. The hare and ravens links to the craft, the green man, primroses, bluebells, and rowan, all of their lore and folk magic associations, how to craft your own besom, all about the witch's broomstick, the witch's familiar, how to find your familiar, as in on the astral plane. We're looking at the goddesses Rhiannon, Ariamrod, and Brigid, the element of air and how you can work with it. And there are spells throughout the book, along with a tarot spread and journal prompts. The link to my Etsy store is in the show notes if you would like to order a copy, and I ship them out all over the world. There are zines on there for all the Sabbaths too, and more to come on other aspects of witchery. I also have a Fae zine that I am also working on, which will be out later in the year too. Right, let's get on with this show then. I'm sure you all have places to go, people to see. So here is our book review. Our book today is Dark Witch by Norah Roberts. Here is the book's blurb. 3 cousins inherit a gift that will transform their lives. Iona Sheehan has just taken the biggest gamble of her life, leaving her job, her home and her family in Baltimore. She's come to Ireland in search of adventure and answers. Iona has always felt a powerful connection to the home of her ancestors. So when her beloved grandmother confesses an extraordinary family secret, she can't resist visiting County Mayo to discover the truth for herself. Arriving at the beautiful and atmospheric Castle Ashford, Iona is excited to meet her cousins, Connor and Branna O'Dwyer, for the first time. And when she lands a job at the local riding school, she finds herself drawn against her will to its owner, hot-tempered but charismatic Boyle McGrath. Perhaps in County Mayo, she has found her true home at last. What Iona doesn't realise is that her cousins have been expecting her for a long time. Connor, Branna, and Iona have all inherited a powerful but dangerous gift from an ancestor known as the Dark Witch. And they are about to discover that some old legends can return to haunt the present. I had this book on my to-read list for a while, and the good old library came through and had a copy that I borrowed. I actually gave this book 4 out of 5 stars on my Goodreads account. It came at a time where I'd struggled with starting a few witchy fiction books and abandoned them as they just weren't for me. This book changed all that and I whizzed through it. Set in Ireland, Iona, our main character, has come over from America to join her cousins. And the first thing I liked about this character is she works with horses. So this book not only had witchcraft, but also horses. I rode horses and looked after them sporadically up until my early 30s. So this was one of the favourite parts I had of the book, hearing about the horses and stable life. I could literally smell the hay through the pages. So not only does it have witchcraft and horses, it has hedge witchery with her cousin Branna, who is always concocting potions and working with plants. It also has romance with Iona and Boyle. Now, I'm not a fan of romance in books. How bar humbug. And this was, I'm sad to say, the typical fluffy, slightly naive woman and brooding, complex man situation. This book, however, was a romp. I really cringe at that word. But it was just pure escapism in beautiful Irish countryside, riding horses, fixing potions, learning the craft. And then we have good witches versus bad witches. This book is part of a trilogy, and as much as I enjoyed this book, I've read the blurb for the next one, which is focused on another romance within the friendship group, and I decided, nah, I'm good. I enjoyed the first one, not that fussed about reading the second one. I do this with a number of book series where I try reading the second one and often give up as the first one normally knocks it out of the water. I know that isn't the case with all book series. Dark Witch is part of a trilogy called The Cousins O'Dwyer. Should you enjoy this one and want to continue? Really enjoyed this book. It was a different read and I think you may enjoy it too. Join me after the break to hear all about toad witches. The Toad Witch. Throughout time, the toad has been documented as a common familiar to the witch or sorcerer. Those who demonized the witch considered the toad their impish demon familiar who would suckle at a devil's mark upon her body, blight fields, and assist in transporting her to the Sabbath. This stems from many cunning folk keeping toads to utilise the various chemicals that can be found in the toad's skin that was considered medicinal and magical. Toad poisons have been used for centuries in order to harm and heal. The toad, being quite a defenceless creature, was gifted the primary defense mechanism of excreting poisonous chemicals, tropane alkaloids, from their skin and the parotid glands found behind and above their eyes. The natterjack toad, Latin name Bufo calamita, is popular throughout European folk medicine and rituals. This species of toad is singular in Europe for producing complex tryptamines, a family of chemicals that includes the hallucinogen DMT. The natterjack contains a high level of bufoviridine alongside the more common bufotenin. Bufoviridine, I think that's how you pronounce it, is an understudied tryptamine that has a chemical structure similar in some respects to DMT. There are natural ways to activate the psychoactive components of bufoviridine that could have occurred within the natterjack itself. Many English and German texts have documented witches or sorcerers keeping a toad familiar, described as a parasitic practice of bloodletting in exchange for the familiar's obedience. Lore sees the toad familiars feeding from the witch, yet the relationship with the toad was that they would be fed and milked, inverted commas I'm doing there, for a substance that the witch could use in ointments and other malefic practices. The witch could create a cycle with the toad whereby she fed them foodstuffs that would give the witch greater magical rewards. By controlling the natterjack's diet with specific foods, she could introduce into its system chemicals that then modified the naturally occurring bufoviridine and bufotenin. This part is written by Eldred Hieronymus Wormwood, folklorist, folk witch, editor of The Skeptical Occultist, the Folk Witch Journal, and the proprietor of Alchemist Press. Maintaining a toad as a living alchemical crucible is, in fact, a relatively simple task, requiring only control of its diet and occasional agitation to some degree. Let us imagine the scene. The witch wakes before sunrise, going to the garden to collect snails and slugs, which have been feasting on particular cultivated plants. Their brown and grey bodies are plump, with a diet of complex chemicals, conine, hyoscyamine, atropine, scopolamine, and a dozen others that, while poisonous to a mammal, call these invertebrates no ill effects. The witch returns to her kitchen, where she keeps her toad familiars in a comfortable box. She feeds them snails and slugs by hand. The toads filling their digestive tracts with the same cocktail of tropane alkaloids, tryptamines, and MAOIs that their meal has previously consumed. The toads, fated with such a feast, may not even notice the new chemicals brewing in their system and simply perspire them out unawares via their urine, skin, or gland secretions. The tryptamines of the toad's natural defences, mixed with the tropane alkaloids and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that's what the MAOI stands for, absorbed from their meal, have now become a powerful entheogenic secretion. When the time comes, the witch returns to milk her toads. Each is gently removed from their box and its parotid glands squeezed to release the desired toxins. The milked toad is returned to its brethren, distressed but relatively unharmed, each in turn providing their portion of the witch's sacrament. To the historical witch and alchemist, this green crucible is both a familiar and a tool. The natterjack toad was a laboratory refining and enhancing organic chemicals in the practice of natural magic, and possessing the qualities required to bring about a profound control of organic chemistry. It was a chemical crucible in which were refined the substances required to transcend the mundane. The secret art behind many ancient European entheogenic and medicinal practices. In Germany, the toad was often used in folk remedies and malefic magic. In German folklore, the poisonous hemlock plant was said to be the home of a toad who sucked its poison from the plant. A German folk name for Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, translates to toad flower. Toads didn't arrive in Ireland until around 200 years ago, apparently being introduced by university students, so there's little reference to them within Irish folk magic. In Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, the toad's head was used as a poison, and the toad's left eye was used to cure vision and blindness issues. Both the toad's eyes were used in Celtic, Slavic, and Scandinavian folk magic to treat a number of ailments. When turned to powder, they were often used in malefic magic. Pliny the Elder wrote of certain toads' bones being used for spells relating to love and creating discord and strife. He also specified that a certain toad bone, prepared correctly, could be worn as an amulet for an aphrodisiac. Agnes Sampson of Scotland, involved in Scotland's North Berwick witch trials of 1591 to 1592, was alleged to have created a poison brewed from a toad. She was accused of creating this poison to use against James VI before he ascended England's throne as James I. The trial revolved around the accusation against Sampson and others that they had raised a storm in a bid to sink the ship James was upon, returning from Oslo with his new wife, Anne of Denmark. Witches were believed to control the weather through making a concoction named toad soup. There was a brew made using frogs, toads, and snakes. Much of these claims were part of the propaganda to eliminate the old pagan ways and prosecute predominantly women as witches on charges of heresy throughout the persecution years. Ursula Kemp, you may remember her from our episode, The Witch Who Wouldn't Stay Buried. Her young son testified in the witch trials at St. Osiph that one of her 4 familiars was a black toad named Piggin and responsible for causing illness in a young boy. An old belief was of witches turning themselves into toads when they wished. Toads and witches were often associated with one another, as folk associated the toad's poison with the poison a witch might make to kill people. The toad was considered a lower level demon who could shapeshift to carry out the witch's bidding, such as spying on their enemies or giving flight to the Sabbaths. An old belief was that should you find a toad in the house, you should remove it carefully, for it could be a witch. This belief spanned several centuries, up to as late as the 1830s. Toads in the house were said to bring bad luck, a spell or curse. In 1566, John Walsh spoke of witches hitting toads and saying a pater noster, the Lord's Prayer in Latin, backwards to a spirit presumed the devil. They would then supposedly send the toad off to hurt people. John Walsh also documented witches giving their toads names such as Great Browning or Little Browning. Tilly Baldry was said to be a wise woman with a sideline in witchery, who claimed that if you waited on the devil whilst carrying a rotting toad in your cleavage, you could ask him to bestow great power on you. The ritual, a little more intricate than that, was described by Tilly. You catch a hopping toad and carry that in your bosom till that's rotted right away to the backbone. Then you take and hold that over running water at midnight till the devil he come to you and pull you over the water. And then you be a witch, and you can do all manner of badness to people and her power over 'em. Said with her accent, no doubt. I've no idea where she's from. No idea. Anyway, during the times of the witch trials, it was believed a witch could be identified from a mark shaped like a toad's foot secreted on her body, or that the image of a toad could be visible in the witch's left eye. Around the 12th century onwards, it was believed that to meet a toad outside was lucky, but should it cross your path from the left, not so lucky. Another belief linked the spider and the toad, as both were venomous and supposedly had an antipathy for one another. It was said should the two meet, they would fight and both be killed in the process. In William Shakespeare's Macbeth, one of the three witches has a toad called Paddock. One of the other witches throws another toad into the cauldron. This particular toad had been under a stone agitatedly, producing venom for many days and nights. So the Tilly Baldry account and the way the witch tortures, prepares the toad in the Macbeth story will all connect up and make more sense as we get into how the cunning folk would prepare the toad for being used. So bear with me. The toad was used for multiple purposes throughout folk magic and was used to treat cancer, rheumatism, the plague, abscesses, nosebleeds, sprains, smallpox, epilepsy, whooping cough, and even the king's evil, which was said to be a tuberculous swelling of the lymph glands, once popularly supposed to be curable by the touch of royalty. Oh, I wonder if that's what King Charles can do for us now. There were different means of preparing the toad for use, depending on if you wanted to use the entire toad or a part of it. Many of the cures required the toad to be powdered. They would be put alive into an earthenware pot and the toad dried in an oven on a moderate heat until they became ready to be powdered. Some other cures required the toad to be kept alive. One cure in Hartlebury, Worcestershire, involved breaking the legs of the toad, sewing the toad into a bag, and hanging the bag around the neck of the person being treated. Wearing something in a bag was a common element in folk medicine. In parts of European folklore, toads would be used to attempt to cure thrush, whooping cough, and tuberculosis. The toad would also be rubbed on warts as a means to remove them. Throughout the plague, toads would often be used as amulets, as their bumpy skin somewhat resembled the buboes on plague victims and were believed to absorb the illness from the wearer. In some rural parts of Britain, toad's liver would be dried into and worn in a pouch around the neck to prevent epileptic seizures. A cure for drunkenness in folk magic involved using the ashes of a burnt toad mixed with brandy. That just sounds like hair of the dog to me, but anyway. The belief in the toad's magical efficiencies against different ailments continued into the 19th century. During that time, there were toad witches, toad men, toad women, toad doctors, and toad fairs. The belief was that they had power over animals and people as a result of a toad bone they would extract in an elaborate process, said to involve sacrificing a toad and making a pact with the devil. Once this ritual had been performed, the individual would become an official toad man or toad woman. Cunning folk would often gather toads originating from specific places they would prefer to use for these rituals. One method involved placing a natterjack toad still alive in a copper pot with holes. It would be buried in an anthill for a duration so that ants could strip the toad's flesh clean. This process would stress the toad enough to produce a considerate amount of venom to ward off the ants. Once the copper pot was removed from the anthill, alongside removing the toad's skeleton, a residue of thick, venomous excretions would be scraped off the pot and used in various ways. Alternative methods involved the toad being placed in a box, pierced with pins, or crucified on a thorn bush, or they would be purposefully injured and left on an ant heap where the ants would pick the toad dry, leaving the skeleton. Kinder folk would use an already dead toad. The frog being alive made as a clear sacrifice wasn't integral to this ritual. Once the toad skeleton was exposed, it would be taken to the river at night. A favoured night for this ritual was on St. John's Eve shortly after Midsummer's Night, or St. Mark's Eve on April 24th. Both nights were said to be significant nights for the supernatural to occur. Midnight was the preferred hour for the ritual to take place. The toad's skeleton would be placed in the stream or river. Some accounts document during this ritual the bones would scream or that they could hear the rattling of chains. They would have to ignore these eerie distractions, focusing on keeping the skeleton in the river or stream, watching until one of the bones separated itself from the skeleton and floated away. This bone was then considered to be the toad bone, magical and filled with power. In some accounts, this would be the point in the ritual where the devil appeared and a deal struck with the toad witch before they left with their magical amulet. The toad bone ritual was described by Albert Love. He was born in 1886. This was in his work published in 1966. Well, the toads that we use for this are actually in the Yarmouth area, in and around Fritton. We get these toads alive and bring them home. We bring them home, kill them, and put them on a white thorn bush. They are there for 24 hours till they dry. Then we bury the toad in an anthill, and it's there for a full month, till the moon is at the full. Then you get it out, and it's only a skeleton. You take it down to a running stream when the moon is at the full. You watch it carefully, particular not to take your eyes off it. There's a certain bone, a little crotch bone it is. It leaves the rest of the skeleton and floats uphill against the stream. Will you take that out of the stream, take it home, bake it, powder it, and put it in a box, and you use oils with it. While you are watching these bones in the water, you must on no consideration take your eyes off it. If you do, you will lose all power. That's where you get your power from for messing about with horses, just keeping your eyes on that particular bone. Bear with me on the horses bit. But when you are watching it and these bones are parting, you'll hear all the trees and all the noises that you can imagine, even as if buildings were falling down or a traction engine is running over you. But you still mustn't take your eyes off, because that's where you lose your power. Of course, the noises must be something to do with the devil's work in the middle of the night. This bone would be used in a wide range of ways. Powdered, it could be added to potions to create a jading oil that was said to bewitch horses and create an invisible influence on an individual. Some toad witches claimed they gained the ability to see in the dark, could control people and animals, and developed a newfound fearlessness as a result of the power gifted to them following the ritual. East Anglia had a secret society called the Horseman's Word. It is said their less organised members would carry out the toad ritual to obtain a toad bone from the natterjack toad to give them power over horses. It is said they used this to help break in horses, calm wild ones, stop them in their tracks, and treat them for certain problems. Although esteemed for their equine skills, they were also suspected of witchcraft. It was believed to be a member you had to perform the toad bone rite in some capacity. Michael Scott, a 13th century alchemist, documented how to create a toad powder derived from the toad's body that could bring fantastic visions. Take 5 black toads and put them in a vase previously filled with wine, which reacts to the toad's venom and results in a powerful chemical transformation. After the toad poisons itself and dies, to prepare them to receive victorious rose, an unknown plant or unknown kind of Arabic plant, and a dried solution of ground Christmas rose, black hellebore, also a mixture of brine water in equal amounts as the previously mentioned dried solution. Also with ammoniated salt measuring 3.5 grams in a hole and dried with urine from 9 pigs from the same field. The resultant dust does wonders and cannot help to. It transmutes everything into perfect clarity as the clarity of the moon. It completely changes the perspective, as Mars is said to do. If you have imbibed the dust at a measurement of 3.2 and drink based on your own perspective, you will find life spirit which transcends and far outweighs the effort or cost you have put into the making of this product. You may use the dust as substitute for salt, as is done by southern Spaniards in northern Italy and in Belgium. Do not document your observations whilst under the influence, though you may record them after the effects have worn off. I have unsatisfactorily, in a pale imitation of the experience, written down my feelings while under the influence in the past. While undergoing the effects of the compound, the now is separated from the then. Even alchemists who deal with red clay and red earth love this bit so much. Dust buffoons, all of them, were able to achieve success by following this recipe. Dust buffoons, that's got to be my new favourite cuss word. What they possessed, few people knew. This type of knowledge derives straight from the blessed God Almighty, which is the first cause of all things. All that is needful may be acquired. By following this recipe, as these men did, I say to you firmly, thus they kept silent as to the recipe and as to the essence of the product, and sold only regular salts in the open. Outside of common folk magic, the toad made an appearance in many European alchemical practices. It would be powdered, dried, and processed to be used by many sorcerers, alchemists, and necromancers throughout the late medieval and early modern eras. Toads were used as charms in necromancy and malefic magic. To kill an enemy, perhaps a fellow witch or sorcerer, a toad would be baptized with the intended's name before being tortured to death. The victim would be expected to suffer the same fate. And a lotion would be made of toad spittle and sow thistle sap that was said to make a witch invisible. Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st century of the toad containing a special jewel called a toadstone that could be extracted from the toad's head while still alive, or the toad would vomit it up. Pliny wrote of the toadstone being an antidote to poison. It was believed that if you placed the toadstone on a bite from a snake, insect, spider, or shrew, it would extract poison from the wound. Toadstones were believed to have the power to detect poison by becoming hot, changing its colour and transpiring a liquid whilst in its vicinity. During these times, medicine was primitive and poisoning was a popular assassination method. It was used as an amulet to protect its owner from magic, misfortune, and intoxication. The Book of Secrets from the 13th century recommended one swallowed the stone to cleanse the bowels of filth and excrement. And then the stone could be retrieved and used all over again. From the Middle Ages through to the 18th century, toadstones were revered for their magical powers and made into rings and amulets. It turns out these stones were mostly fossilized teeth from a Lepidopithecus maximus, an extinct ray-finned fish from the Jurassic period taken from the northern seas. Nigel Pennick, author of The Toadman, has written extensively of magic in East Anglia. His book, The Toadman, was bound in cloth and toadskin leather. In its pages, and obviously I picked this up from an article, I don't happen to own this book. He writes of those, so the person who wrote this article said that he was referencing those who held the toadstone's power. I think that the author of the article referring to Nigel Pennick's book actually meant one of the Toadman rituals and owning that particular power. Anyway, Nigel Pennick quotes that anyone who held that power might be driven to insanity by exercise of these powers. A violent death is to be expected. An old toadman, when asked what one would need to do in order to gain the same powers, warned, "Don't. If you do, you will never rest." The toad is considered a liminal being that can dwell on land and in water, within this realm and the other world. In folklore, the toad was said to eat coals of fire that could be interpreted as hellfire, connecting them to the underworld. You may wish to work with the toad as a magical ally or familiar and draw upon their many magical associations. Some other energies they can assist with in spellwork and ritual are earth magic, grounding, abundance, working with tree spirits, malefic magic, cleansing, rebirth, transformation, and major changes. That is all I have for you today, witches. Thank you so much for joining me. I will link anything that I've mentioned or referenced into the show notes so that you can find them there. Have a great week, and I'm sending you lots and lots of witchy love.